I'll get us going. So tonight we're covering Job. Last week it was myself and Kathy and James, and we talked about Psalms. And I was going to talk about Job, but we kind of dragged our feet in Psalms, and I said, hey, let's just wrap up a little early, and I'll save Job until next week, because I told them I believe Job may be one of the most important books in the Bible, because it helps us wrap our, I'm not going to say it answers a question, it helps us get a good view, a good perspective on one of the questions that people have had since Job's time, which is essentially, why do bad things happen to good people? Now, I told them, I love what R.C. Sproul says, because he'll do a lot of questioning, he did do before he went to be with Jesus, a lot of question and answer type things, and people would always ask, why do bad things happen to good people? And if you know anything about R.C. Sproul, he was a great man of God, great preacher. He was very much just blunt, and he'd kind of lean in and he'd say, why do bad things happen to good people? That only happened once, and he volunteered. Fact of the matter is, there's no such thing as a good person. Good by our standards, yes. Good by the perfect standard of God's holiness, not so much. So any good that happens to us is a blessing. It's not something we deserve. It's an act of God's grace. And anything bad that happens to us, technically we could say we deserve. But you have Job, who, is a righteous man. And the entire book is, we get this prologue where it kind of tells us what's happening. And then the whole thing is just conversation between Job and 4 of his friends. And they're trying to help him, but they're not succeeding. And then at the end, Job pleads his case to God, and God answers. And he says, gird up your loins like a man. You've been asking questions, now it's my turn to ask questions of you. This is what God says to Job. No, you know what, I've changed my mind. And then God goes in for a few chapters and asks Job all these questions. But anyway, it is one of the most difficult questions, I think, for most people, at least who are not Christians, to wrap their minds around, is that, even if it is sort of technically a false idea of why do bad things happen to good people, if God is so good and God is all powerful, how come there's all that? Where does suffering fit into the picture? Okay, now you apply that then to God's people, which is who this is written to, and okay, how does suffering fit into being one of God's people? And Job answered, again, he doesn't answer it. Job gives us perspective on that, some very important, like, heavenly perspective on that issue. And this is one of those questions or those issues that people claim keeps them from coming to the Lord. I can't believe in God because of this. They even have a whole specific theological term for it, and it's theodicy. Theodicy, that idea of, if God is good and all powerful, why does he allow suffering in the world? So it's a whole category of theological study. But before we begin, a couple things. One, if I've recommended to you before the Bible Project, it's online, it's totally free. You can type in Bible Project, Google it, and pull it up, and they have videos for different books of the Bible. They have videos for different themes in the Bible, videos for different groups of books in the Bible. But they have an excellent video on Job under their wisdom literature category. It's about 7-8 minutes long. I really recommend it. Like when you go home, Bible Project. Just go home, check it out. They make some of the most fantastic videos that I've seen. They're very well done. But they do a great job. I mean, if you can summarize Job in less than 8 minutes, they do it. It's real good, so I'd recommend that. And again, I cannot recommend this book to you enough if you're at all interested in, the things that we've been talking about. This is a biblical theology of the Old and New Testaments, The King and His Beauty by Tom Schreiner. And it's so good. It's The King in His Beauty. It's so good. It's so readable. I doubt anybody would want to just sit down and read from cover to cover. It's not that kind of book. You could do that, but if you're studying a particular book, this is a great resource. Very well written, very well researched, and Tom Schreiner is the James Buchanan Harrison Professor of New Testament Interpretation. That's the thing about academia. You got to love the titles. Anyway, he's at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. I like his stuff. He's a good guy. So if you're into studying these kind of things, it's a good book. Since you asked me to look at it. We'll refer to that book a couple times tonight. So if you have a Bible or access to one, you can turn to Job. So Job is part of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. It is poetry. Apparently, and I don't know anything about Hebrew, but apparently it's very dense, complex Hebrew poetry. So it's not, roses are red, violets are blue. Job suffered a lot. How about you? It's like it's epic poetry on the level of the Iliad or something like that. It's a big deal. I got this from the Bible Project. They did a great job laying it out. Because Job is placed differently in the Hebrew Bible. It comes after Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, I believe. And so if you think about it, in Proverbs, and this is the way they lay it out in that video, Proverbs is just basic wisdom for living your daily life. And the wisdom that we find in Proverbs is, act wisely, be godly, and, you'll reap what you sow. This is God's design. The principles of the world are, if you act with wisdom, then you will be rewarded for that. And if you act foolish, you get consequences for that, right? Boneheaded decisions equal bad consequences. Living with wisdom gets good consequences. That's the principle. Then you have Ecclesiastes, which is kind of like, not always. Sometimes, it doesn't work out the way it's supposed to. Sometimes that principle doesn't apply. And then you have Job coming along, kind of, again, giving us that heavenly perspective on, when it doesn't work out the way we think it ought to, when the principles don't seem to fit. And it's a recognition that the human experience is not, just one-dimensional, like, inputting stuff, talk about applied mathematics, inputting something into the equation and then getting something else out the other side of the equation. That's not life. Life is more complex than that. Our experience is more complex than I did something good and something good happened. Sometimes it's I did something good and what in the world happened? How do you explain that? And sometimes we, one of the main themes of Job is that sometimes we just don't see all the pieces of the puzzle. We don't see all the bits of the mosaic. And in those moments when we can't figure out what God is doing, what He's calling us to do is trust in Him. That at the end of trust in Him that He can see the whole picture. And that He's putting it together and painting it in such a way that righteousness wins out in the end. All right, even if we don't get to see it, and that's kind of God's response to Job is sort of like, hey, do you see everything? did you design the world? Are you causing everything to work together the way it ought to? Maybe not. So Job. We don't know who wrote it. There is almost no way to positively identify when the book was written either. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know when it was written, which to me might be a good thing, because that kind of adds to the timelessness of the content. This doesn't just fit with the time of the patriarchs. This doesn't just fit with the time of the monarchy in Israel. This doesn't just fit in the time of the judges. It's almost like it doesn't have, and I'm going to be careful here because context is critical, but it's almost as if the context for Job is like all of human history, right? It's timeless in that way. The Bible is timeless, but this is addressing an issue that humanity has been trying to wrestle with since Job. I have heard some scholars say that they believe Job, the events of Job, that Job is the oldest book in the Bible. Not the events, because the events of Genesis are obviously Job couldn't have happened before Genesis, but that it was written prior to the Pentateuch. So that Job was written before Moses ever lived. It was maybe written in the time of the patriarchs, like Abraham. But again, there's for every argument that it was written then, there's maybe two that it wasn't. So we don't know. And the bottom line is it doesn't matter. We know who inspired this, and that's what matters. Job deals with, as I've said, one of the central questions of humanity. Why do the righteous suffer? It's easy for us to look at bad people and see their suffering and go, well, duh. Boneheaded decisions equal bad consequences. We can see that, and we like that, right? When the wicked get their just desserts, okay, that's good. That's the way it's supposed to work, right? That's why when you see, this is a horrible example, but you see someone like a mass shooter, and they go and they, shoot up a shopping mall, and then they kill themselves. And there's a part of us that's like, justice has not been served because they should have been brought to trial and we should have killed them, right? I mean, is that not part of kind of our flesh, our human understanding of justice? Anyway. Description of Job. This is where we're going to get. So the first, 2 chapters are the prologue. And if you don't look at the first 2 chapters of Job, nothing else makes sense. God, as he inspired Job, and through the author, whoever it was of Job, they show you their cards right off the bat. Okay, so if you didn't have the context of chapters 1 and 2, that introduction, you'd be going, what in the world is going on here? Not just that you'd be confused, but you wouldn't understand Job's friends, and you wouldn't understand Job and what he's going through. This is essential to getting out of Job what we're meant to get out of it. So Job 1:1. We don't have to go far to get to a description of the title character. There was a man in the country of Uz named Job. Not Job. I don't know why. I mean, it looks like Job. Job. He was a man of complete integrity who feared God and turned away from evil. That's the description that we get. Now, when the Bible describes somebody as a man of complete integrity who feared God and turned away from evil, that guy is on the right path. Never, it doesn't say, we don't get the idea that he was sinless. That's a whole other ball game. But in his actions, in his life, in his interaction with God, he was an upright man. He feared God, and he didn't walk in evil. He took care of his family, verses 4 and 5. His sons, used to take turns having banquets at their homes. They would send an invitation to their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. Whenever a round of banqueting was over, Job would send for his children and purify them, rising early in the morning to offer burnt offerings for all of them. For Job thought, perhaps my children have sinned, having cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular practice. He took care of his family. He was a priest for his family. What does a priest do? A priest intercedes. A priest stands between and intercedes between man and God. All right? Now, again, New Testament believers, we are all a kingdom of priests, right? So but he did what good fathers need to be doing, which is interceding for their kids. Listen, my kids have been partying like crazy over here at their place, and I don't know what's been going on, but I'm gonna go before God on behalf of my children. And then you get to verse 8, and now this is God speaking about Job. Then the Lord said to Satan, and a lot of people will make a big deal about it. It is there should be like an indefinite article there. It's the Satan, the Satan, which is a descriptive. It's the adversary, the one who opposes, which is why we call him Satan. But yeah, it should say the Satan. Same person, same being. So here's what God said to Satan. Have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity. If you're starting to get praise from God about your walk with the Lord, there's something to be said for that. That's like when you look at the book of Daniel. Daniel is one of those characters in the Bible that, because eventually Job does have some things that the Lord takes issue with as you move through the text. But if you look at somebody like Daniel, there's not anything negative said about Daniel.
About what?
About Daniel. In the book of Daniel, there's nothing negative said about him. He is a type of Christ. There's not much negative said about Joseph either. So you have a few people in sprinkled in, like in the Old Testament, that like Enoch. He walked with the Lord for like 365 years, and then he was not. The Lord took him because he walked with the Lord all the days of his life. And then God took him up to heaven. He just kept walking with the Lord, only it was in person. So there are these examples of people who are not, we don't see the word righteous. And so he's not perfect, but they're walking in holiness. They're living in integrity. They're living in the fear of the Lord. That's some pretty high praise for this guy. All right, Job is elevated, and it's not him doing the elevating. It's just that's the story that we're given. This, if you read through the first few verses of Job and you don't get the idea, hey, this is a good guy. He's been doing great. Like in my mind, Job should be prospering. Okay, and he did. So. In his day, I would say in our day too, there is this understanding in religion that is centered on retribution. That usually has kind of a negative connotation to it, but let's think of it in just kind of its technical sense. It's you reap what you sow, that principle, right? Which, guess what? We see that in the Bible. Okay? But what happens when we don't reap what we sow? What happens when people like Job and really terrible things happen to them? Is he reaping what he's sowing? Because that's what his friends, that's the understanding that Job's friends have. Now they can't see. They don't have the first 2 chapters of Job. They didn't get to see what was going on in the throne room of heaven with God describing Job as someone who is a man of perfect integrity. They don't have a clue about that Satan has asked to test Job or anything like this. They don't know that. All they know is You reap what you sow. This guy is reaping some really bad stuff. What has he done? Job, what have you done? And like that, maybe that's a summary of all of his friends' advice is like, what did you do? That's what they understand. Not only that, so the reap what you sow principle gets into trouble when people who are sowing good things all of a sudden start reaping bad things. But it's equally troubling, at least for me, when people who are sowing really bad stuff reap really good stuff, right? I mean, what happens when, the guy who is a complete dirtbag treats everybody with contempt, abuses and mistreats his employees, does everything he can that is shady and under the table, and the guy is making bank. And you're like, I know that guy is a total jerk. And yet, he's getting all these, he's living a good life. What gives? Right? That we don't have a category for that in you reap what you sow, because he's sowing bad stuff and he's reaping good stuff. What gives? Right? So Job's friends come into play in chapter 4. And their whole mentality, again, is you're suffering, which is clear. So what happens to Job? Let me back up just a little bit. Satan says in verse 9 of chapter 1, sorry, I backtracked on you. Hopefully it's only one page. Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he owns, and he'll surely curse you to your face. So Satan comes up and stands before God Almighty and says, you see, and God says, you see Job, he's a man of perfect integrity. And Satan's like, the only reason he's that way is because you keep blessing him. You take away the blessing, he'll turn his back on you. Guaranteed, because that's what people do. They only worship God because they think they can get something from him. That's Satan's argument, right? And so God allows Satan to take everything from Job. He takes his sons, his daughters, his cattle, everything. And then he begins afflicting Job's body too. So he's covered in boils. I mean, the guy the only thing he didn't lose, I think, is his wife. And she wasn't very helpful. Verse 9 of chapter 2, his wife said to him, are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. Just be done with it. Just shake your fist, just blaspheme God. He'll strike you down and it'll be over. So Satan takes everything this is the part that you kind of, there's that giant horse pill that you're trying to swallow. He does it with the permission of God. God says, you do have your way with it. God gave Satan permission. Now that's a two-edged sword. The other side of the sword is Satan had to ask permission. Okay? Any idea that we may have, and I know I think I had this deep down inside me at some point in my life. Any idea that we have that Satan is out here doing whatever he wants and can do whatever he wants in this world, he can and is dead wrong. Satan does nothing without the express permission of God. He does not have, he has a very short leash, okay? And it's a choker collar. He doesn't get to do anything without God's permission, because who rules and reigns this world? Is it Satan? Now, Satan has some authority in like this world that we live in now, in this time period. But that authority is under and is given to him by God, who has all authority. One of the things that we have to walk away from Job with is an understanding that God is absolutely sovereign, and nothing happens in his world without his permission. That's meant to bring us great comfort. And I think it's one of those either or propositions. Either we know that and we go, yes, like there is nothing that I'm ever going to face, there's nothing that ever goes on in this world that is beyond and outside of the control of God. Or the other side is, you mean God could stop all of this and he doesn't? Like, and that's where is your faith and where are you going to land? Where is your trust in God going to take you with this truth? So Job's friends look at Job's situation. Everything's gone. He's just sitting there in dust and ashes with boils all over his body. He's shaved his head. And they're like, dang, Job, you are suffering. You must have done something really, really wrong to deserve all of this. And Edward Curtis says the book makes it clear that retribution, while generally true, is inadequate as a comprehensive explanation for suffering in the world. That is, you reap what you sow. That's generally true. I mean, the Bible makes that clear. But it can't explain everything that goes on in this world. It just simply can't. And that's where Job steps in. The book steps in. Tom Schreiner, in that book there, he says, true wisdom recognizes that life is complex and defies simplistic answers as to why there's suffering in the world. Because look, let's not be Pollyanna about it. There's suffering in the world. We know this. We've probably all experienced it to one degree or another. We certainly will at some point in our lives. There is suffering. It's real. And oftentimes it happens to God's people. So what do we do with that? The prologue of the book, what we just talked about, pulls back the curtain on this situation so that we know that what Job's friends are saying, hey, you've done something wrong, you must have, or you're being punished, you're suffering, you must have done something wrong. We know from the outset that that's not true. Because here's a guy who's lived in perfect integrity, he's walked in integrity, he's a family priest for his kids. God says he has integrity, so we know he's not being punished for his boneheaded decisions and his disobedience to God. We know that what is happening is that God has given Satan permission for a bigger purpose. There's something else going on here. All right, so main theme, I kind of already mentioned this, is that God is sovereign. Satan had to ask permission. Job recognizes God's sovereignty in chapter 1, verse 21. I love this. This is one of those verses you have to you want to hide in your heart and cling to when suffering comes your way. So all this has happened. His kids are gone. Then Job stood up, tore his robe, and shaved his head. He fell to the ground and worshipped, saying, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will leave this life. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I want us to be real clear on what happens here. His kids have just been wiped off the face of the earth. He stands up, he tears his robe in an act of mourning. He shaves his head in an act of mourning. He falls to the ground and worships. Like, I don't know if I have that kind of character, that kind of strength of character when bad things are happening. And nowhere does the Bible tell us not to cry out or not to mourn or, it's not that big a deal, Sarah Lynn, just get over it. The Bible doesn't say that. And the image here of this man who walks in integrity, who is broken, and he is mourning and crying out to God, and yet he's able to worship. That is a strength of character that only walking with God all the days of your life can give you, right? That can only come from the Lord. He acknowledges God's sovereignty. I came in naked. I'm going out naked. God gives it. God takes it away. None of that was mine anyway, right? In chapter 2, verse 10, after his wife says, curse God and die, he says, you speak as a foolish woman speaks. Should we accept only good from God and not adversity? Throughout all this, Job did not sin in what he said. He's crying out, he's mourning, he's dealing with, at this point, he's scraping himself with pottery, and says he did not sin in what he said. He maintained his integrity. Now again, he gets into some questionable territory as the story moves on, but at this point, he's still upright. Chapter 42, verse 2 says this, Then Job replied to the Lord. So Job has just withstood, let's see, something like 6 chapters of questions from God. Okay, God's been piling it on. Then Job replied, I know that you can do nothing, and that you can do anything, and no plan of yours can be thwarted. I know you can do anything. He's speaking to God. And no plan of yours can be thwarted. You do what you want to do, God. I can't stop you. Satan can't stop you. Leviathan can't stop you. Behemoth can't stop you. You measure the stars in the span of your hands. Who could stop you? Right? Job acknowledges the sovereignty of God. We don't know, and I mentioned this earlier, we don't know what all is going on in the spiritual realm, which we need to acknowledge exists. That there is another realm that we can't fully comprehend with our 5 senses. And there's things going on there that we don't get, right? That we're not privy to. We can't see the big picture about anything, you know. I can always look back, and we can always look back in our life, and we get a better picture of some of the things that we've been through in our life. But it's going to be a long time before we see the big picture, the whole picture. And that certainly is true about the suffering and the trials that we face. We can't see what God is doing in that. Sometimes we catch a glimpse later on, but I believe it's going to be on until we're in glory before we know the full extent of what God was doing in the trials that we've been allowed to go through. So why in the world, why would a good God allow all this to happen? I mean, Job's a good guy, really good guy, and God just let Satan have a heyday. What in the world? What kind of demented God do we have? Well, it was a matter of God's glory. Satan's accusation, while directed or specifically about Job, is really more of a matter of God. It has more to do with Satan's claim that the only reason that people worship God is because he does nice things for them. Right? That impugns God's character. Like, the only reason that you're getting worship is because you do nice things. In other words, you're not worthy of worship beyond the nice things you do. And Satan says, I'll prove it to you. Just use Job. And God says, try it. Is God worthy of worship no matter what we have, what we are given, what we face in this life? Like, is there such a thing, in the fancy term of, is there such a thing as disinterested piety? Can we worship God even if he never gave us a good thing? Is he worthy of it even if he never did anything good for us? Even if he never blessed us with one thing and all we did was suffer in this life, would God still be worthy of worship? Because it really gets down to, who are we worshiping at that point? Are we worshiping this God who is actually worthy, or are we worshiping ourselves? God's only worthy as long as I'm getting good things. Well, who's that really about? That's about me. God, you're worthy no matter what. That's about him. And that is what sparks this whole thing. Tom Schreiner again says, Job and all human beings live their lives before heavenly beings. Okay? And they either bring praise to the Lord or vindicate Satan's claim that human beings live only for themselves. Either we bring honor and praise to the Lord or we vindicate Satan's claim that human beings live only for themselves. Nobody talks about that when they read Job. They just talk about how awful it is that these things happen to a good guy. Never mind the slander that Satan spoke against God Almighty. You'd think he'd know better. The depth of Satan's depravity is incredible. So how are we going to live our lives? Are we going to live our lives? And again, I'm not sitting up here saying, I hope we all go through this like Job did. No, I'd rather learn by Job's example and say, okay, Lord, I'm going to worship you no matter what so I don't have to go through it. But then again, that's like the whole, I'm going to do good so I get good. It's tough, y'all. But this is essential to understanding our life as Christians. Like the New Testament and church history, you have to look at it through the lens of Job. All the suffering that Christians have gone through. We read a lot of stories. I don't often get the opportunity, but so Andrea mostly reads these stories to the kids, and it's one of them's I think called Our Island Story. At any rate, it's a book about the history of Great Britain, since we aren't considered an island here. But that's the book, and it has these, from the Romans on through. And there's stories of Christian martyrs and people who went to the arena. And all they had to do was say Caesar is Lord. But the confession of Christians from the New Testament until today has not been Caesar is Lord, but Christ is Lord. And that was a punishment, that was a capital offense. When you live in a time when the emperor is deified, is turned into a god, and you say, no, Caesar is not Lord, Christ is Lord, then you get thrown into the arena and they laugh at you as you're torn limb from limb by wild animals. And it's incredible. Like, gee whiz, God, these people are sold out. They're on fire for you. Like, being on fire for Jesus in the first century was very different than what it means now. Because in the first century or second century or third century, to be on fire for Jesus meant you were strapped to a pole on fire for Jesus. Why did you let this happen, God? This doesn't seem right. We're supposed to do good things for you and we get good things back. See, it's not quite as simple as we want to make it out. The Christian message is not that when you come to Christ, there will be no suffering. That's what the prosperity gospel peddles. Hey, you come to Christ and look at all these blessings. Look at all these things. You're going to have all the money. You're not going to get sick. Nothing bad's ever going to happen. You're going to live your best life now. Right? That's what the prosperity gospel preaches. This seems to be at least one of Job's friends' take on everything. Eliphaz, the first one to speak in Job 4:8, says, in my experience, those who plow injustice and those who sow trouble reap the same. If gee whiz, Job, I don't know what you did, but you did something. So you might want to do something different. In chapter 5, he goes on, Eliphaz does. However, he says, if I were you, I would appeal to God and would present my case to him. He does great and unsearchable things, wonders without number. He gives rain to the earth and sends water to the fields. He sets the lowly on high, and mourners are lifted to safety. He frustrates the schemes of the crafty so that they achieve no success. He traps the wise in their craftiness so that the plans of the deceptive are quickly brought to an end. They encounter darkness by day and they grope at noon as if it were night. He saves the needy from their sharp words and from the clutches of the powerful. So the poor have hope and injustice shuts its mouth. And he goes on. I'm not going to read the rest. But like, is all of that true? Like, in some sense, yes. There is a sense in which, well, we know, like, unqualified, God does great and unsearchable things, wonders without number. Are the lowly always set on high in a way that we can see that? Or does God always lift the mourners to safety now in this life? Does he always frustrate the schemes of the crafty so they achieve no success? No, sometimes it's quite the opposite. It looks like, gee whiz, God, why are you not frustrating the schemes of the crafty? In the eternal, like, final analysis at the end of history, yes, all of these things are true. But perhaps not in this life. And that's where we get hung up. Eliphaz says some things that sound very true, but they aren't in Job's situation, because Eliphaz doesn't know. He doesn't know that Job is a righteous man. He doesn't know that Job hasn't done anything wrong. Sure seems like you have. Bildad's solution, I love them, Bildad. Who was the shortest man in the Bible? Huh?
What did you say?
Who was the shortest man in the Bible? Bildad, he was a Shuhite. Dad jokes rule. So Bildad, he says that repentance is the key. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? Since your children sinned against him, he gave them over to their rebellion. But if you earnestly seek God and ask the Almighty for mercy, if you are pure and upright, then he will move even now on your behalf. And Job's sitting here going, but I am pure and upright. I don't even know what I should be repenting of. Bildad doesn't either. It's not. These guys are the theologians that know everything. These are the theology professors in most seminaries. We got this. I'm going to tell you what's wrong. That's not what's wrong. You don't know what's going on. You don't know the situation. It's more complicated than what you think. Is repentance a necessary part of the Christian life? Yes. Like, hands down, no questions asked. But sin does not always explain suffering. Remember when there was the man, I can't remember if he had been born blind or he had been blind for 40 years. Or maybe that was the same guy. Maybe he had been born blind and he was 40 years old. So the scribes and the Pharisees asked Jesus, hey, who sinned, this man or his parents? Because in their eyes, if you're born blind or if you're blind, they were Job's friends. They were of the same theological school of thought as Job's friends. If you're blind, if you have leprosy, you must have done something wrong. And what does Jesus say? It wasn't him or his parents. This man's been born blind so that God can display his glory. Okay, reverse that back and apply that to Job. Like, what did Job do? Who sinned here? God says nobody sinned. This all happened so that I can receive glory. All right. The message here in this book is, how do we live in light of real suffering in the world that God allows? Like, because that's the reality. If there is suffering in the world, and if God is all-knowing and all-powerful and all omnipresent, that he allows this suffering if he is sovereign. So how do we live in light of that? And Job answers us. We live upright. We live godly lives no matter what, because it's right. We worship him because he's worthy. Not because he's given us good things, but because he's worthy. That's the thing, and that's where we have to go. That's the place we have to get in our heart. Job, again, worships after tearing his clothes when his children die. Throughout all of this suffering at the beginning, Job didn't sin or blame God for anything. He never blames God. He's confused. He doesn't understand. But he doesn't blame God. We have to understand that our ways are not God's ways. So for 4 chapters, I was wrong, for 4 chapters in 38 through 42, God responds to Job. All this, people have been talking. And it says, then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. He said, who is this who obscures my counsel with ignorant words? Uh-oh. Get ready to answer me like a man when I question you, and you will inform me. Imagine God speaking to you and saying, you know what? Why don't you tell me how things are supposed to be? Why don't you tell me how, what does he say? Where were you when I established the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who fixed its dimensions? Certainly you know. This is all like divine sarcasm, right? Surely, Job, you must know because... and of course the answer is, oh yeah, I don't know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? What supports its foundations? There's good evidence for flat earthers. Foundations of the world. It's a disc on a pedestal. It's not a globe. I'm so kidding, y'all. What supports its foundations, or who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the sons of glory shouted for joy? And he goes on for chapter after chapter with this same kind of thing. And they describe it in that Bible Project videos as God taking Job on a tour of creation and the complexities of creation, the intricacies of creation, and how it all is held together, and that God is not aloof and distant, but that God is intimately involved in the goings on of this vast, complex creation. And then at that point you go, yeah, I don't have any answers for you. Maybe God, maybe, just maybe, you know more than I do. And that, we're in desperate need of that attitude today. Just that humility before the Lord, that He knows better than I do. And our humanistic culture, where man is the measure of all things and human reason can get us anywhere, and we think we are the apex of, I'm not going to say creation because culture doesn't believe it's creation, but if we're the apex of nature, then and you see it in people's attitude and the way they talk about God. They think they know better than God. And that's a very dangerous place to find oneself, is thinking that you know better than God. And that's kind of where God takes Job, and then Job responds in humility. Let me see, can I see that book? I want to read a quote out of it real fast. This is not from Tom Schreiner. He's actually quoting somebody else. He says, so this is the end. He's kind of summarizing God's message to Job. God's answer is this: I'm the only one who can manage all the chaotic forces of life and who can bring about the ultimate triumph of righteousness. And I know what I'm doing. If this has meant some suffering on your part, you must understand that this does not mean that I'm unfair or that you have the right to challenge my justice. I will do what must be done to defeat Leviathan and all the powers of chaos and evil. This may sometimes require suffering on the part of the righteous, but I will bring all things to a just conclusion. Your role is simply to trust in my wisdom and goodness. Your role is simply to trust in my wisdom and my goodness. There's many things that God reveals to us in His Word, and He's given us far more understanding than we deserve. But at the end of the day, there are some times and some things where we just have to say, God, I don't get it. I don't get it. But I'm going to trust you. And I'm going to trust that in the end, you're going to bring all this together and work all things together for the good of those who love you. Schreiner says, what makes life worth living is not the absence of suffering, but rather a relationship with the living God. It is seeing the King in His beauty. That's what makes life worth living. So that's Job in a
Can't Job be summed up as God is sovereign and doesn't owe us an explanation?
yeah, pretty much.
That's
I
basically
said,
it.
why didn't you tell me that at the beginning? We could have saved
Well, I
like
started
an
to, I said,
hour.
no, wait. But I did a Sunday school, when I taught
Yeah.
Sunday school, we did the book of Job, and I used a tape from a minister of the First Presbyterian Church. Was it Presbyterian or Methodist? I think it was Presbyterian in Columbia, South Carolina. And then we'd also did it in the men's Bible study. You may have been here when we did that. But that's basically what he concluded.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah,
and to me, it goes back to my verse Romans 8:18. Our present suffering does not compare to the joy to be revealed. I mean, to me, that's all you can say. We just have to look at this 70 to 100 years that we're here, and it's just so small
Yeah.
compared to what's down the line. I mean, it's the only way you can really, to me, the only way you can really get through and accept.
And I don't think we're called to go after suffering.
Right.
It's going to come. We just need to be prepared to live well in and through it.
Yeah.
You know, there were kind of fringe Christians in church history that like just went after suffering, like martyred themselves, you know, or you know, harmed themselves in an act of because suffering. And it's weird because that's like very Eastern almost. Like I'm just gonna pain is weakness leaving the body kind of thing. And that's not what we're called to do. The Bible just says suffering's a reality and live well in it, through it. You don't have to chase after it. You don't have to manufacture it. And I certainly am not going to go looking for it. But anyway, any other questions? Thoughts? Does that make any sense? Does that help you with
Yeah,
Job?
but things happen in everybody's lives
Mhm.
that things that we don't like.
Yeah.
But down the road, you can look back and you can see his hand. And what if, we had done this, we wouldn't have done that. I
Right.
mean, this wouldn't be.
Yeah.
And so we don't need an answer immediately either.
No, and even that little glimpse we get when we look back isn't even the whole thing. Like there's still more to learn about what, all these things lead to something. Proven character, perseverance, hope. And hope doesn't disappoint. God's doing something. And sometimes it's not even about us. It had nothing to do with Job. He just happened to be the instrument for God gaining glory and sticking it to Satan.
But he did come back. God restored
did, yeah.
everything and plus more.
And that's the thing, you read that and you go, oh, okay, so the message is, have a stiff upper lip and God will bless you in the end. And that's not it either, because remember, God is sovereign. Now, God blessed Job and did restore everything, but that's not the,
Then we're not
that's not,
waiting.
yeah,
Well,
that's
could
not
you-
the principle.
Could you take the stand that Job is a description of eternity? The fact, Job suffered,
I got
we're
you.
suffering.
Yeah,
And on this earth, no matter what happens, we have to look forward to. Well, Job, all this stuff that happened to him, it was restored. Not the same people, but he had children again.
Yeah.
He had all of his animals restored tenfold.
that's really good.
And you could just kind of say it's a description of life and eternity.
Yeah, because it will be restored.
Right.
It just might not be
Yeah.
on this side of eternity.
Yeah.
That's
I
good.
just threw that in
Yeah.
extra.
Man, you're on fire tonight. I'm going to turn the camera on you. Yeah, no, that's really good. Because what does Jesus say? He says, if you lose, anybody who loses this is going to be restored to you tenfold
Yeah.
in eternity. So that's, look at you. A+, man.
A gold star for Ed.
Ed
Look at
gets the platinum star tonight. All right. Anything else?